Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Susan Linder, your host of the Innovation Storytellers, where we try to get behind the innovation itself and talk about the stories that lead us to get to these real breakthrough places in our businesses, in our lives, and also in our actions with our customers and our partners. So I am beyond thrilled to have a repeat guest on the show. Not something that we do that often, but when you have a superstar in your midst, you really have to bring these people back when they actually have time in their schedules to have a conversation. And I'm so, so grateful to have my friend Steve Rader back with me here at the podcast. If you don't know Steve yet, you should. And if you're not familiar with the topic of open innovation, the idea that innovations can come from not just inside the four walls of your organization, but outside, if you are brave enough to look, then you are going to please buckle in for a fantastic conversation on this topic. Let me give you a little background about Steve before we get started. Steve started Crowd Resources Consulting LLC in 2019 as a little side hustle to his full-time job at this little mom and pop shop called NASA. And his goal was to provide organizations with resources for leveraging the crowd-based expertise and solutions that are required to stay competitive in our rapidly evolving economy. Steve just retired from NASA, where he served as program manager of NASA's Center for Excellence for Collaborative Innovation, which is working to infuse challenge and crowdsourcing innovation approaches at NASA across the federal government. It focuses on the study and use of curated crowdsourcing communities that utilize prize and challenge-based methods to deliver innovative solutions for NASA and the US government. Steve has worked personally with various projects and organizations to develop and execute more than 100 different open innovation and open talent projects. And we're going to be talking about some of those today. And he speaks regularly about crowd-based challenges and the future of work based on his 12 years of experience leading open innovation efforts at NASA. So, Steve, I'm just so thrilled to have you back on the show. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you, Susan. It's been quite a ride, and I always like talking to you. It's always exciting, and I always learn something. So,
Oh, likewise. So you left NASA and you're doing other fantastic, amazing things in the process. So this is an interesting time to be leaving the government and leaving NASA, but it seems like you've really left a legacy of open innovation at NASA that I don't know if that would really exist. You are so well known for bringing open innovation along with other great people in the organization to NASA. Can you just give us a little bit of a snapshot for those folks who aren't that familiar with open innovation yet, what it looked like at NASA prior to having a real concerted effort and a real concerted practice around open innovation? What's the before and after makeover edition of open innovation at NASA?
yeah, so before, and this would have been the 2010, 2009 time frame. It was really like every organization, right? You have your specialist teams, you have a problem, you put those teams on that problem, and that's how you work. And Dr. Jeff Davis started a lot of this work at NASA along with Jason Cruzan and Lynn Bucco. And I actually read the Open Innovation book in 2010 and was floored. This was Jeff Howell's book. I was floored by the potential of how open innovation works and its possibilities for NASA. And that's what Jeff and Jason and Lynn were all thinking. And so they started these programs at NASA to see, does it work? Should it work? How should it work? What should we do? And I fortunately was doing parallel stuff where I was joining a bunch of crowds and trying to understand what this all was. And then in 2013, they had an opening and I moved into that world and started working it. And I think to say before and after, it's been a long journey. That Center of Excellence was stood up in 2011. I joined in 2013. So 12 years ago, when I joined, we were still working out, well, what's the process? How do we use this? How do we connect the people? There's an entire case study that's taught at Harvard Business School all about how open innovation failed at NASA initially because Jeff Davis saw how amazing it was, and he basically ordered all of his people to start using it, and they rebelled because there's a dynamic when it comes to open innovation that we have to understand, where if you're the expert, the idea of outsourcing the most fun part of your job is not something that's going to be well received. And so we had to kind of take a step back and figure out, okay, what are these barriers? What are the cultural barriers that are keeping people from using this? What are the logistic barriers, like in the legal system, in the procurement system, that just because this works really well doesn't mean somebody has the cycles or the year-long process to go make a contract with Topcoder to go do something. They don't even know what Topcoder is. How do you pick that? How do you have a competitive bid? And so in those early years, what we invested in was process. How do we knock down these speed bumps? How do we get the messaging so that people will accept it and use it as a normal tool? And as part of that, we figured out the why. We needed to explain people why this was necessary. It wasn't just a cool tool. It was a necessary tool because technology is changing at an ever increasing pace, and that the amount of technology that's being put before us on a daily basis is just it's the pile is getting higher and higher. One of the things I talk about in my talk is it's a study that somebody at Harvard did a while back, and it basically looked at patents and research. And what it came up with was a statistic that just stuck with me, which is that today, and this was actually probably 5 to 10 years old, so it's probably worse now. But as of that study, the estimate was that there were 90% of all scientists that have ever lived on planet Earth working today. So think about that for a second. 9 times more
Right.
people are working in the technology world than all the people before them, right?
Than in the course of human history, really.
Course of human history, right? And if
Right.
you look at the area under the curve of an exponential curve, this totally makes sense. But they're not using paper and pen to define new things. They're using ChatGPT and 3D printing and CRISPR and all these amazing tools. So this exponential growth of solutions and new technologies, that's not going to slow down. There's 25,000 universities and higher education systems around the world now, which 100 years ago simply was it was a fraction of that, right? And
Right.
so we're getting all these qualified people. Hard problems don't go away, right? New technology actually introduces new problems that then you have to go solve those. So that big machine is creating a really an environment of change that has affected everyone, including NASA, right? So if NASA wanted to stay on the cutting edge, this was a necessary kind of tool that we needed to understand, because it turns out that just because you have this problem doesn't mean you have the answer. But open innovation is like this magic sauce or magic tool that can be used that works really kind of as a statistical dragnet across all the industries and all of the R&D work that's going on around the world in a way that really nothing else does. So if you don't have open innovation in your toolkit and you're just Googling, okay, I need a new product and it needs to address this, and you say, Google the latest technologies to go do that, you're not going to find them. You think,
Mhm.
because everyone's addicted to Google and they think these big searches are going to get what you need. But the reality is you need not just the latest and greatest technologies that are in your industry. You need to look across industries. You need ideas out of people's heads that understand your problem in a different context than what you're used to. And that's the magic sauce that open innovation brings, these prize challenges where you put a big chunk of money down and say, help me solve this problem. Those attract the unsuspecting people, the experts out there that you didn't know you needed, that you never would have hired, and you still probably wouldn't hire them, even when they give you a great idea. But now you have that great idea that you can go after. And it's the idea, it's the technology, it's the expertise. All of these are the components that bring in. So to answer your question, what's the difference between the snapshot? Well, one, we were doing business as usual. And at the end of the day, when I left, we had a process where most folks at NASA knew it existed, and we had a process of actually embedding people throughout the organization that understood the process, understood what open innovation was, could recognize problems that were a good fit, because it's not a good fit to do everything. It's definitely a specialized discovery tool, but that we have that process going. And now NASA has a better chance of staying up on the cutting edge because our folks know, hey, when I go to innovate, while I'm a great innovator, I need the best starting place possible. And that means I need to go out into the world and find those best technologies, those best experts, those best ideas, and build on that, and then go implement that, right?
It's funny because I think about how as businesses we've evolved. And I remember learning about GE, and GE recognized pretty early on that they had created an environment where they created a culture of lifers, people who were going to stay in the organization eternally because A, they were handsomely rewarded, there was a lot of status associated with it, and they were doing good work. So the organization didn't want to lose them. And as a result, in the 1950s, they created the first corporate university, which was Crotonville. A lot of people remember the parody of it from 30 Rock, but it was a place where GE recognized that they couldn't hire the brightest minds in the world perpetually. And so they decided they would bring the greatest speakers in to teach their executives how to know more, do more, see more than what they could see inside of the walls at GE. So that seemed to be step one. Step two, and lots of corporations followed that example, right? And then the consultant class emerged, right? Where there was a whole other industry, myself included, right? Where, and you as well, Steve, right? Where people go, oh, but I need this expertise, and I'm going to invite people in and help ask them for their expertise to solve my problems. And I will take their advice and step back and then implement it. Right. So I might be on the corporate side, I might be the data feeder. And then my consultant will do the heavy lifting. And McKinsey comes in with a 100-page slide deck and says, there you go, Merry Christmas. Good luck at implementing that. Right. And that model has existed, right? And we call it business intelligence and knowledge management and lots of other snazzy titles. But open innovation is a different twist on that, right?
Yeah.
Because number one, it portends these people are not going to be in your life if you don't want them for a very long time. They're ideas for hire and they're innovation for hire. Number two, they come from unsuspecting places that we wouldn't necessarily know to look. And I highly encourage you to check out the first interview I did with Steve more than 2 years ago. I think you were in the first 10 episodes of the Innovation Storyteller show. And Steve's phenomenal potato chip story, it is legendary. It has circulated the globe. I highly recommend you look for that. But we then go into places like your challenges wind up surfacing people who didn't know they had the expertise that you needed and could provide it in a way that you could understand and apply. Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, it winds up, the long and short of it is, a violinist winds up providing a very important industrial solution for an industry that never thought they would need a full-time, a part-time, or even a one-time cellist on board to, violinist to solve their problem. But can you give us some other real-world examples, Steve, of where you found the answer man and woman in places that you never thought you would?
It happened repeatedly. Like, it was such a pattern that we saw it over and over. We were going for, early on, we were looking for a solar flare prediction algorithm, right? So at the
Who
time,
isn't? I mean, that's my weekend. Forget it. I am always
well,
looking for solar flare
I
prediction
know.
algorithms.
Well, at NASA, we have our astronauts on the space station. Sometimes they're out on spacewalks. And if there's a solar flare, they literally have a limited amount of time to get inside and to get into a very particular part of the station that's protected, right?
What
And
happens in a solar flare? Is that like an incredible surge of heat and light? What's
it's,
happening?
it's a big radiation burst,
A
basically.
radiation
You're,
burst.
you're
Okay.
going to have cancer if you don't get out of that.
Wow.
Like it's a kind of guarantee if you're not in the right shelter. And in the atmosphere, we are really protected from a lot of that. But even when there's a solar flare, they will tell people to like, hey, you might want to stay indoors today. But on the station, we had a 2 hour we had a 8 hour prediction capability.
Window. Uh-huh.
No, I'm sorry, 2 hours. We could give you 2 hours prediction. So if you were out at the edge of space station, it could take you quite a bit of time to get all the way back in, out of your spacesuit and back in. And that was cutting it pretty close. And so NASA was trying to double that number.
Mm.
So we put out a challenge to see, can we find us on Top Coder? And
Top Coder's a website, right, where you can
yeah, Top Coder,
write
they
code.
currently have like 1.8 million software developers and data scientists on that one platform, right? I think at the time it was closer to 500,000 because it was early days. But at the end of that competition, the one who won, and he gave us an algorithm that actually could detect a solar flare before it happened by 8 hours. So
Wow.
4 times what we had, double what we were trying to go for. And it was really interesting because he was a retired kind of cell phone engineer, right? Communications engineer who had also had an undergrad of heliophysics that he had never really used, right, in the workplace. And he was able to take the mathematics behind signal processing that can kind of pull a signal out of noise and apply that mathematics to the solar flare problem and come up with a whole new way of basically predicting solar flares. This is someone who had some domain knowledge and then brought in some technology from another area, right? The Mars Balance Challenge, when you go through the 7 minutes of terror, whenever they do a Mars mission, they talk about how trying to land on Mars is so tricky. Well, part of that is when you go from space into an atmosphere, you go from being able to use gas thrusters to move to then using aero surfaces to move, kind of like airplane flaps, right? And there's this in between time when you're not really in space, but you're not really in enough atmosphere. And neither of those work predictively. And so what they actually have there is they actually use balloon technology, like from the early 1900s or 1800s.
Like hot air balloon?
Hot air balloon technology, where you actually take a mass and you throw it off the vehicle, and by throwing it one way, you go the other way. So they can do that at different angles to get different kind of trajectory adjustments.
Wait,
Well,
didn't this happen with George Clooney and Sandra Bernard? What was her name?
so what they had been doing is taking solid tungsten all the way to Mars in case they needed it to adjust the atmosphere in this 2 second period, or maybe a little longer than that. But just to throw it overboard. And so for years, they kept thinking, is there a way that we can actually get some scientific value out of that instead of, because it's really expensive to take any mass all the way to Mars, right? And so we posed that out to the crowd. And this is something our scientists have been looking at for a long time and hadn't come up with much. And when they put that out there, the winner ended up being this marine biologist, I think is what his firm was. And he was an independent contractor for the oil and gas industry. He was from Rising Star, Texas, population like 800. There's just no way we would have hired this person. But they put in a proposal that said, if you use barium and you eject barium in the atmosphere, it will actually dissolve. And then you can use this other satellite that has a mass spectrometer to analyze the upper atmosphere. And you can learn a lot about the upper atmosphere that way. And turns out that's a great way to do that. And he went and actually presented to JPL and did a bunch of stuff. And they're still trying to find the right mission for that. But and again, someone from a very different area that has expertise that somehow brings it to bear. And we just saw that over and over. And that there's been some really great stories where solvers have come up with stuff and then they get addicted to solving. So they actually come back and they'll solve another thing and they'll come back. There's this one woman in Australia, Lauren Fell, who was a psychologist who ended up changing her career path because of challenges, teaching herself CAD, teaching herself how to 3D print, teaching herself how to do Raspberry Pi and electronics and robotics, ended up getting a PhD in quantum cognition and now does TED Talks and has a startup on lunar greenhouses. Like this stuff changes people's lives. It's crazy, but it works.
These are like crossword puzzle solvers on crack,
It is.
right?
It is.
It's like
It is.
once you finish one New York Times crossword puzzle and you fill it all in, and you're like, I am God. I can fix anything and I want more.
So it's funny. So we actually had Kareem Lakhani and his crew at Harvard kind of study all of this early on. And one of the things they came up with was that the reasons people do crowdsourcing and the reason, because that's the first question people have is why are people spending hours and hours on these contests? It seems like doing work in your spare time. But it's those people who like crosswords. The four things are gold, guts, glory, and good. We call them the 4 Gs. Well, gold is money, right? If you're going to offer a cash prize, but a lot of people do it for the guts. They love to solve hard problems, and they just want to do
Mm.
that all day long. And then there's other people who are trying to get a reputation, and they want to be able to say, I have done this. I've done this for NASA. I've done this for GE. And then there's other people who they just want to give back. They want to do something for the planet. And for a lot of people, NASA has a mission that they believe is good for humanity. And so they would see their participation as their contribution to space exploration. And that those all kind of work together. And the best platforms know how to offer all of those incentives kind of as part of the package. But I tell people, I think open innovation is attractive because it's one of the few places that you can try your crazy idea and no one's going to judge you. No one's going to give you a bad grade. No one's going to yell at you because you wasted their time. It's your time.
It's your time.
And if you don't make the cut, nobody actually knows. Nobody cares. But if you win, like there's all sorts of gains that you can have. And we actually had a researcher, this is when we were doing differential privacy for NIST. And we had this
What's
one
NIST?
NIST, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology. So they're the ones who say a pound is a pound, right? They do a lot of things. But differential privacy
Depends
is
what I had for dinner, but go ahead.
the, they were working on how can we take data that needs to work in machine learning algorithms and mask that data so that sensitive data like PII, the personal identifiable information, or things that people would want to get a monetary gain off of out of nefarious means. How can we mask that data but still get the good predictives out of these data sets? And so this is a science, it's a lot of math and a lot of stuff. But what was really interesting, one of the winners, she said, I'm a researcher and I do this for a living. I do differential privacy research. She said, but the solution I gave here that won, my PI, my boss, never would have allowed me to do.
Mm,
And we forget that researchers, like everybody, have to play the risk equation. And
right.
you're trying to get funding, then you're going to try to keep it a little bit safe. Can I actually succeed on this grant so that I'll get more grant money? And you weed out the more risky stuff. But we all know innovation is about risk and failure.
That's
And
right.
and this is the kind of thing that you get with open innovation is you get the crazy ideas. Now, you also get the crazy ideas.
You
So
get the crazies too. Wait,
part of
before,
open innovation is filtering all of that out. And that's where these companies are really good at figuring out how to do that.
yeah, I want to get into the crazies in a minute, but I want to stop for a second and talk to my audience for a moment about how much are we restricting is the reason that we are not innovating because we are self-restricting in the process of finding great answers to tough questions. And I think what you're describing is so important because on this show, we talk about the stories that we tell to get big ideas to the finish line. And I kind of love this idea of saying, well, I can't get it there myself because of the restrictions placed upon me by this place, but I now have this beautiful little backdoor opportunity where I can host an open innovation competition in order to get big ideas in without making risk management, compliance, and governance pull their hair out.
Yeah. I think exactly right. Warren Berger wrote a series of books of A More Beautiful Question and A Beautiful Question. In that, he really talks about this bubble that you have around your organization, especially if it has deep expertise, right? So a bunch of really top-notch scientists in one particular area that they have a self-reinforcing kind of ethos to them about what they believe and what will work and what won't work. And so they what happens is they reject ideas that come at them kind of out of hand because, well, we just don't do it that way, or somebody tried that 10 years ago and it didn't work. And it's there for efficiency, it's there for lessons learned and filters, but we find that especially in this day and age where we have all these new technologies coming at us and new ways of doing things, that being open to these new ways is an important piece. And you're absolutely right. Open innovation is the way to do that. It does take a little bit of effort to get the lawyers and the compliance people to understand, hey, there's not a risk here. You're importing things here. You're not exporting. You're not exporting our IP. You're not exporting. Some people worry that if you pose the problem out there, that somehow that's going to give something away.
But that's a competitive, even asking the question is a
Asking the
competitive
question.
advantage,
And
right?
what they don't
So,
is that's how these companies make their money. They know that companies have this problem. And so they're actually really good at doing one of two things. One is masking that it's your problem. So for instance, you mentioned the potato chip example. So the potato chip company that was trying to get the grease off of the potato chips, one of the things that Incentive at the time did was they changed the phrasing from how do you get grease off of potato chips to how do you remove a viscous fluid from a delicate wafer? And they didn't name that this was a food company or anything. They posted that challenge. How do you get a viscous fluid off a delicate wafer? Now, that did two things. One, it invited more than just food scientists and food production engineers into the game, right? Now, anybody who understood physics and fluid mechanics and that kind of thing could actually be somebody that posed an answer. And that's one of the things we watch for in open innovation is how have you posed the question? Have you limited your crowd simply by
mm,
posing it in your jargon and if
right.
or your context? But the second thing addresses this whole issue of sensitive data, which is nobody knew this was a potato chip company. So how was that actually going to give anybody an idea that they had an issue with this and expose anything? And the companies are really good at kind of masking what's out there. One of the examples I use, some people aren't going to like this, but I'll tell it anyway. And that was there was a challenge posted on Topcoder, no name of who it was. And the challenge was, how can you take existing public uploads of pictures off of social media of Yellowstone National Park and using just that public data, track the individual location of every single bison in Yellowstone National Park. So tracking the
Just put a
thousands.
bunch of tourists out there and wait till they get wait till
Well,
they get
and you're
ramped.
literally taking just their pictures that they've uploaded and the time tags and the locations, and then facial recognition and all that kind of stuff. Somebody actually created this algorithm and software that would do just that. So they
Wow.
succeeded, right? Turns out the client was the CIA. And what they really wanted was an algorithm that could detect Russians in Crimea. And it worked. It worked great. And
Wow.
they used it that way. Now they gave me permission to talk about it and everything. It was funny. I actually told that story while I was on a panel with Mike Morris, who was the CEO of Topcoder at the time. He's like, I remember that challenge. I had no idea who that was. He didn't know it was the CIA either. So you can protect your information in lots of different ways. One is to reframe the question. Also, you can simply break the problem into smaller pieces to where it's not recognizable as the sensitive thing. So that's the other piece of all of this. It's an important tool is problem analysis and really understanding how to break a problem into its key pieces to understand what's the most valuable pieces to fix. So instead of taking this really complex problem and shoving it out there and hoping that everyone understands the nuances of your organization and all the constraints and assumptions, breaking that down into pieces that actually have a better chance of getting solved and finding those pieces that if you solve that one piece, the rest of it can come together.
Mm. So tell us a little bit about the crazy that you've heard as well, Steve, because these stories blow my mind.
Oh my gosh, the crazy. Well, I mean, so crowdsourcing is like mining, okay? So when you're mining, you've got to shovel a lot of dirt and ore to find the gems, right? And
Right.
not only do you have to shovel it, you've got to actually have mechanisms that kind of get rid of all of the crap so that you can find the good stuff, right?
Right.
Crowdsourcing is like that. You're going to get a lot of people, and people filter in different ways. Some crowds will actually filter the crowd so that you get diversity, but you also have to have a minimum kind of understanding of this problem or something. But then other places will actually filter the solutions, and they'll actually look through all of your criteria for what you've said you need in a solution, and they'll basically eliminate the submissions that haven't met that minimum criteria. So if we say, hey, make sure you've given us an analysis of the power consumption of your design, and somebody leaves all that blank, well, guess what? That doesn't make it into the fray. And those kinds of things are actually going to get better and better with generative AI is really good at doing that kind of evaluation against a rubric. And so that's the kind of thing you can do to kind of eliminate it. But oh my gosh, we did one called Space Poop Challenge, where we were literally, when you go to the moon, once you do that burn to the moon, you really can't just turn around. You're like 6 days before you're going to be back. And so if you have a cabin leak, the backup is to put on your spacesuit and live in that spacesuit for 4 to 6 days. That means you've got to deal with some human issues that if you've ever dealt with diaper rash, you know that that
Sure.
can become significant in a relatively short amount of time. And what people don't realize is in days that can become a significant health problem, especially if you end up with a cut or something, you can actually become septic, right? So it's a
Right.
significant issue. We put it out there. It was on HeroX, and we ended up with something like 20,000 registrants and 5,000 submissions. And they filtered those down to the top 87, but they also would send me the craziest ones. And so I'll never forget, they showed me one where someone had decided magnets was the way to go. I know that's the tilt of my head that I had. The idea was that you could embed in the food iron filings and ingest a certain amount of iron filings, and then when things came out the other end, simply use magnets to pull it away from the body. And then they proceeded to show us a trial that they wanted to start. Yeah, no, it was terrible. And
For those who are iron deficient, this would
yeah,
also help on the mission.
it was just terrifying in a number of ways.
Oh my God.
But what was funny is that wasn't the only magnets submission. There were a number, like apparently people think magnets can fix everything. So
There's
again,
a lot of like infomercials about copper and
yeah,
magnets and all that stuff. I'm having flashbacks of like those little toys we used to have. I'm old enough to remember this, where playing with iron shavings was fun, where you get like a face and then you had a magnet, you'd make eyebrows on it and a mustache on it. But that's what I'm visualizing while we're talking about this.
just don't take a bite. Just don't
Yeah,
take
exactly.
And I make fun, but I shouldn't, because the out of the box
Never know.
thinking requires a lot of failure. Because what you're really getting is that failure that is required in innovation, but you're getting it on a massive scale. And you do have to be careful when your evaluation that you at least try to think about what's possible and what's not possible. So, now that one had a health concern, but there are things where you want to be real careful to not say, oh, that's just crazy, right? So it is this kind of delicate balance. The nice thing is the reason we use these curated crowds and these companies is they do this regularly with their community. And so you get a natural kind of set of people that understand what good submissions look like. And you get a crew that's evaluating that knows how to encourage that. And they know how to make the forms so that if people leave things blank, I don't even want to look at that because you didn't understand that you had to provide that there needs to be some supporting data there. And so I think that's one of the reasons we didn't just turn around and host our own challenges, because there's an expertise to it. There is a way to do this. And if you do it right, you're tapping into a community that's already knows the barrier of entry of making an entry to a technical challenge has already been breached. They already know that. And you can still invite anyone into it. So if they have a good PR and marketing, they have a good crowd, they have a good platform, they have a good process, they have a good crew that knows how to do it, this stuff is a breeze. Here's the thing, open innovation just by itself as a concept is hard. People think that you can just go do this yourself. You don't understand. I've seen so many companies fail when they take a couple of admins or folks in HR and they say, hey, go build us an open innovation platform. And we want to do this open innovation thing. And then it fails 9 months later and they don't understand why. And you're like, well, you didn't train them. You didn't use a platform that knows what they're doing. Like these are complex, sophisticated tools that you have to know how to use. But right now, they're super important to use because if you're not using them, you're potentially losing out. I'll give you my lose out story that I tell every once in a while. Subsea 7, they do a bunch of things in the oil and gas world, but one of the things they do is they inspect the pipelines that go from the offshore rigs back to shore, right? And they do this by taking a ship out. It's something like $1 million a day. Apparently, it takes a lot to operate a ship. And then they
So
lower a van-sized piece of equipment next to that pipeline. And it takes them about 2 weeks to travel along with that pipeline and inspect the whole thing, right? For the average kind of length. They went out to Nine Sigma, did a challenge, and after about 2 weeks, they found a technology already in use in the mining industry, not in a lab somewhere, but already in use that was handheld and could be used to do that same job in 2 hours instead of 2 weeks. So that's 100x improvement on performance, right? But here's what they said. They said, yes, we're really happy about that, but if our competitor had found this technology before we did, we would no longer be in this business.
wow, that impactful.
That, that's the thing that open innovation can try to help protect you from. Because if you're not watching the different technologies, you can become victim to these big disruptions where the technology is secretly incubating over here in mining or banking or somewhere else.
Totally
And
different
if someone
industry.
connects the dots,
Right.
adapts it over, and that's where just some disruption can come from.
So let's talk about behind all of this is like, yes, great ideas, but they don't fall from the sky. They fall out of brilliant people's brains. And it really is a testament to how quickly the workforce is changing and how quickly the demands of the workforce are changing. Now, when you and I first spoke, it was right on the heels of COVID. We were looking at the gig economy and we felt like COVID was this catalyst for a shift in how we thought about work, what had to be done in the office, what we could do at home or on the beaches of Brazil or while doing the laundry. Do you think that COVID was the catalyst for our work from home awakening or gig worker awakening, or was something else triggering that?
I think so. We started looking at the gig economy back in 2015, right? And we were already seeing predictions that said there would be more people in the gig economy than in full-time employment by the year 2027, 28. And so we were monitoring that and we were trying to figure out why, like, why are they all leaving? And then COVID happened and it kind of accelerated things. And you heard a lot more about it and you got a lot more real-time experience about it. I personally believe that the reason we're going through this change, this shift, is the rate of technology and the scope of technological change, right? That 90% of all scientists working, right? That kind of stat, like there's just so much going on right now
Mm.
that is impacting companies that all these new things that are coming on require new experts and they require new learning. And at the end of the day, if you're using recruit and retain full-time employees as your only model for how to actually be agile, then you're going to be in trouble because those fixed set of folks can't keep up with all the technology. I tell people the open economy, the open talent work, the freelance platforms, they always contain people that know the cutting edge. Your company, I don't care how big you are, you can almost guarantee you do not have all the people in all the technologies that are cutting edge. And so you've
And
got
by the way, you didn't want them anyway because
right.
they were disruptive. They didn't want to conform to whatever. They already were in another gig. Like for all the reasons why they could not, they don't work for the 900 other companies in your category, right? That you are just one of a number of companies they don't work for.
Yeah, and if you think about the old model of hiring someone, it's who would agree to come to your location from around the world, and if they're from another country, how do they get the visas, all that stuff.
And
But
if you would even consider them, if they
would
came
you
from another part of the
consider
world that you don't want to go to.
exactly? And
Mhm.
then you're saying, and you've got to come here and be in this office 40 hours a week. Now compare that with the labor pool now that could likely do a ton of that job. Probably 60, 80, 90% of that job could be done from somewhere else. Now you're
And
putting
is being done from somewhere else. It is
absolutely.
already being done from somewhere else.
Now,
Yeah.
I'm not saying there aren't advantages to people working in the
Mhm.
same place. There are absolute advantages, and you've got to find what that mix is. But people are wanting to be black and white on this and say everyone needs to be. Well, you know what? We digitized all our work years ago, and now everyone sits in front of a computer, largely working on email or software programs. And yes, there are things that can happen when you have people in the same place, but I operated a 20-person totally virtual team that was virtual from the pandemic on, and that team became more high performing when we were all remote. And part
Wow.
was we required everyone to have cameras on. We had happy hours. We had all the things that
Oh,
were.
the Zoom happy hour. I'm having a flashback.
Then we also had like 3 or 4 face-to-faces a year. We brought everyone together for the bonding experiences, and we had kind of norms about how we worked that was more intentional. Turns out good teaming, I believe, has a lot more to do with how you manage your team than whether they're in person or virtual.
Mhm.
Hybrid is actually hard because it's hard to actually do that equitably. But remote, you can have a high performing team, no question.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think that like our old management structures of command and control, the ones we adopted from the military in olden days, I feel like that is akin to the recruit and retain mindset, right?
yeah,
Because it really does come down to control,
yeah.
right?
Well,
That is the kind of secret emotional management happening behind those two theories.
I think that's definitely you. If you are paying someone, especially if you're paying them an hour, what you think of as an hour, even if you're paying them a salary, you've paid for them to be in the office for 40 hours. Well, everyone knows that's not true, right? There's the imaginary work hour, right? But what we showed everyone in the pandemic was, oh, I really can get most of my work done and do a load of laundry and go pick up my kids and do this other stuff, and you never knew the difference because I was still doing, and in fact, many studies showed people were more productive because they weren't constantly being interrupted.
That's
Now, the
right.
problem for the manager is, but how do I know? And part of this
Mhm.
is there's a concept that, well, if they're in the office, they're working. Well, everyone knows that's actually not true, right? They're talking, they're doing things. And it's nothing against workers. It's simply we don't work 8 hours straight. We have to have these times where we rest or we walk or we talk, and that's all okay. But what it comes down to is we should be paying for results. We should be paying people because they got the result that we wanted them to do. And I think it's lazy management to say, well, no, you simply have to be here. And when I think of something, you have to do it. Why not actually have that thought process about what do I need from this person and making sure that they know what that is.
Mm.
And honestly, if one person can do that in 3 hours and it takes somebody else 5 hours, okay, that's part of the equation too. But why would I pay them differently for the same result, right? And I really think that we're going to get more into this, especially with large language models that start to actually help us create task descriptions that are measurable, to actually deploy and measure what people are doing in a way that people can actually work on whatever they need to for whoever they need to. It's not just a what you work on, is why do I have to be tethered to one organization? As long as I have an NDA and an understanding of what I can share and can't share, I see freelancers that navigate that every day and work for 5 different companies, and they're not susceptible to layoffs in the same way. They're just as smart. In fact, I would say they're smarter because they're understanding perspectives from other companies. And so I think that the freelancer is the new model that stays agile. Now, again, I don't like black and white thinking. I think there are still plenty of opportunities for full-time, but I'll ask on the full-time side, why aren't you letting people have 5, 10, 15% of their time doing some gig work where they can learn something new? Your biggest problem right now in an organization is upskilling and keep people aware of new technology. Why not use open innovation and open talent as a way where they could make a little money, get a little prize money. It's free to you. Like as a company, there's a little thing you can do there to actually make people smarter and a better asset to your company. But why do you need to own all of their time, I guess is the bottom line.
Right. And by the way, are you owning all the productive time anyway? Just because
Exactly.
you own it doesn't mean
Exactly.
it's productive.
Yeah, yeah. And everything we're doing from here on out is about upskilling. It's about lifelong learning. And if companies haven't adapted to where they're bringing their workforce up as technology is changing, and then just dumping them out in big mass layoffs, you're going to just see more people moving to the gig economy. So we're already seeing it. It'll be interesting to see how it all turns out.
The people equation is important. I think if we zoom out into the big picture, Steve, I would love to conclude just thinking you've had such an expansive view on open innovation. It's such a contribution to the discipline of innovation, period. What is the big picture takeaway you think for all of us?
I think the big picture is things are changing so fast and at such a magnitude that we as organizations need to actually start adapting better to that change. And that means new tools, new ways of working, new ways of thinking about things. Honestly, those are survival tools. Those aren't to be the absolute best. These are literally survival tools. And I think that's the important piece for the freelancer and the laborer. I think there's a huge opportunity here to live your passion and do the things that you love the most. And we can get all into that kind of new way of working. But once you have these platforms that are finding you the work and that you're creating relationships and you get repeat, like you start to create the best of both worlds, the best of community and culture. Because just because you're a freelancer doesn't mean you're a one and done. You can actually still form relationships, still be part of the culture. We did that at NASA. We had some of our team members were freelancers. And I think those are the big takeaways is how do you stay agile? How do you stay part of this? Because the rate of change is only going to get faster. There's no chance it's going to slow down. We can hope it does all we want, but we're simply not going to see that.
Well said. Steve Rader, thank you so much for joining me on the Innovation Storyteller Show today. Where can people get in touch with you if they want to tap into this brilliant mind of yours?
You can just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty open there and I love talking to people. I love talking to you, Susan. It is always a blast. I always get a lot out of it. And I love what you're doing for the whole innovation community. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And that's Rader, ER, Rader. Oh, boy.
No second day. Yeah, exactly.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Thanks.